Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise, and grateful for your company on this rather dreary evening here in London. Anyway, I think most of you know the drill for a thinking by now, but let me just recap a couple of simple things. So, as you know, this is our attempt to do better the kind of editorial discussion, editorial meetings that happen in newspapers and broadcasters up and down the country every day. And that has led us to one simple rule, which is that whatever happens, we don't want questions. So this isn't a panel show. We want to hear what you think. We want to hear what you know. We want to hear what you've experienced, but we want a broad ranging discussion. We don't want you to throw questions in, but we definitely do want you to chip in. So please let us know your view. You can do that in a couple of ways. You can do it through the chat, which my colleague Kim is going to be looking after. Kim is up there somewhere waving at the screen. So Kim will be looking after the chat. There she is. And I'll try to keep an eye on that. And if I see or Kim sees interesting things in the chat, then we'll try and pull that through into the conversation as well. The other way you can get stuck in is to just put your hand up. There's a way to raise your digital hand, which you'll see in the chat function. And then we'll look out for you and we'll bring you in directly from there. So please do help us out here, because I think in many ways this is an ideal subject, I think, for a thinking, because I'm not sure that any individual has perfect sight of what's happening, but I hope that together, collectively, over the next hour or so, we can bring different bits of knowledge and perspectives to bear and try to jigsaw together an understanding of what's really happening around the country. So we're here to talk about the effect that COVID has had on school rolls. And I think the thing we know for sure is that it has had an effect. So there are fewer children on school rolls now, I think, than there would have been had we not suffered a pandemic. We can see that absences from schools have gone up. Now, you'd expect that because people are ill, people are self-isolating. But I'm not sure that we fully understand all the reasons for those absences. So I'm fascinated to hear, to get more closely into what those might be. We can see that there's been a really sharp rise in homeschooling. And that's something also that we want to talk about. But I think our real question is, in amongst those absences, around that rise in homeschooling, are there children that we have just lost sight of? And if there are, what risks are we exposing them to? And we have, as I said, a lot of people with a tremendous range of experiences to help us piece that together. So we've got, although I think at the moment she may be having some technical difficulties, we've got Anne Longfield, who's the Children's Commissioner for England. We've got Marva Rollins, who's a former head teacher, now an education consultant. We've got Richard Watts, who's the leader of Islington Council. We've got Sir Dan Moynihan, who's the CEO of the Harris Federation of Primary and Secondary Schools. Then we've got our own Chris Cook in the room. I think we're hoping to have Louise Tickle, who's a reporter who's done a great deal of work around this, and a bunch of other people who have expertise in social work and education as well. So I think if we get our teeth into this, then hopefully we can, by 7:30, we can begin to, at least you can begin to help me understand this a lot better than I currently do. Anne, are you there, Anne Longfield, or are we still looking for you? Okay, we'll come to Anne when she's with us.
No, I am here.
Oh.
No, only just, but I am here. Sorry about that. I just had to switch machines, but we're done.
Well done. Just will do fine. Thank you for that.
Advanced level.
And let me just start by, I think it's almost useful just to remind ourselves what was happening before we hit choppy waters. So have we always had something of a problem with children who should be on school rolls and in full-time education not being there? What's your readout of the pre-pandemic situation?
Sure. Life before the pandemic. I think there's two aspects here. One is I did about a year's work looking at homeschooling, probably about 3 years ago now, and found that the number of children who were being homeschooled was rising really rapidly. And I did that work largely because a lot of local authorities were raising concerns about the numbers and the number of kids that were then out of sight. And the number had risen to at very least about 50,000, and some local authorities were putting the figure potentially at about 80,000 across England. And we've all got this idea of who those children might be, but actually the families who were choosing to homeschool because of philosophical reasons, I felt they were probably about 20%. So of all those children, you're potentially talking about 60,000 children who aren't in school because either the school isn't providing the support those children need, both parties have kind of got to the end of their tether, or indeed someone wanted to go off the grid and not be part of the oversight. So that was kind of the homeschooling aspect. In terms of kind of vulnerability, looking particularly at the number of teenagers that were vulnerable before COVID, we calculated about 120,000 children, teenagers were, and that was quite a high bar on how you got into this. It meant multiple exclusions or multiple times out of school, referrals to social services and the like, but 120,000, and that's about 1 in 25 teenagers. They were clearly not engaged in school to the level they might be. And my concern was that number has surely grown during the pandemic, and that it would be very difficult for them to re-engage with school as schools returned. And all of the support services, or a lot of the support services around them, including youth support, which were often the ones that they felt they had a relationship with, had either dissipated or gone online. So those were the
and if I'd naively assumed that if a child was supposed to be in full-time education, then someone was keeping tabs on where he or she was. And even before the pandemic, might I have been wrong sometimes? Were there some children who just weren't on the radar?
Yeah, so there were children who might be temporarily excluded from school or permanently excluded from school. And again, talking about significant numbers there, around 2,000 children a day being at that point temporarily excluded, and around about 8,000 children throughout the year being permanently excluded. And then some of those children going to alternative provision, where the rate of persistent absence was 70% plus. So you can see there that there are children who don't have structure to their day, don't have those kind of constant relationships, and aren't getting the education that we would expect them to get. And certainly if you go to the kind of point where you talk to young people that are in custody, virtually all of the kids that are in custody will say they've not really been in full-time school since primary school. And that clearly causes disengagement, they're marginalized, they're more at risk from other sources, including exploitation.
Yeah, and I started, I don't know if you were on the call at the time, but I started by saying I certainly didn't feel that I had a clear picture of what's happened since, since lockdown, since schools went through all the sort of disruption that they've been through over the last nearly a year now. Have you got a clear picture of what's happened to those children who were slightly at the margins of education before this thing hit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is yet unknown. And one of the things that we really want government to do is to monitor closely who those children are who aren't in school. Now, going back to school in September, the numbers were high, despite the fact that infection rates and isolation and things like that were keeping some kids out for certain periods. But 8 out of 10 children were in school, which I'm told, it's usually the figure is about 95% on average. So there's clearly a proportion of children there who aren't in school. We know that for children with special educational needs, they were often the children who were most likely to be off-rolled or taken into homeschooling. They often had difficulties going back into school, partly because there may be added concerns about their welfare and health, but also they might need more specialist support. But of course, now we're into a different place where we're back into home education itself. This time around, there are more vulnerable children who are going into school. The last time there were about 2%, rising to about 8% of vulnerable children going into school. This time the figures are higher, and actually these figures were just out today. There are now about a third of pupils with an EHC plan in school, 40% of children with a social worker. But that does mean still you've got 3 out of 5 children who are vulnerable who aren't in school.
Okay, so Kim, if I can come to you, Kim Darrow, my colleague, because Kim has been looking at trying to understand what patterns are emerging, what we do know at this stage. So Kim, do you want to just, some of you will have seen the slides as we were just getting ready for the conversation, but Kim, if you want to just talk us through them very quickly, that might give us a bit of a basis just to keep the conversation going on.
Hi, yeah. So I've been scoping out some of the numbers behind this, and what you see now on the screen is, I'll start by sort of just going over, just zooming into the autumn term and what happened with attendance there. So what we saw is that this blue line on top is what attendance usually looks like, just over 95%, and then the yellow line is what it looked like in the autumn term. And you see, like, right from the start, that was right at the beginning of the second wave, it was already quite low, and then as you follow it through, it gets much worse after half term. And then if you go to the next slide, I've sort of zoomed in further onto 1 week to look at the reasons behind those absences. So what happened in the last week of that term, there was about 20% of students missing, so attendance was 80%. And of those 20% that were missing, this was the picture. So about 37 or roundabout were isolating. 8% weren't there because school was closed. 2.3% had a suspected case of COVID. 1% confirmed case of COVID. But then we have this other half that are sort of unknown. And that's where it looks like we're getting these sort of persistent absences. And then, yeah, if we go to the next slide, what we do know is that there's been a huge jump in the number of homeschooled kids. So this data is from October to October, and that is a 38% increase sort of year on year. But also, I mean, note that that's only October. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that had kept going up since then. And I mean, as is quite clear here, I guess the issue is like what happens to those children and whether or not the authorities have the right resources to sort of focus on them. And if we go to the next slide, another thing that's quite striking is that there's like these quite stark geographical disparities in where the low attendance is. And so there's some areas where attendance is actually pretty high, like around, like hovering in the high 80s to 90%. But then there's other areas, and they tend to be the much poorer areas where attendance is really, really low. And they tend to be the areas where you get more children on free school meals and more sort of just and the poorer areas. So now if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go into just like a sort of final example of actually at the school level. Now there's not usually data at this level, so this is pulled from an interview with the head teacher of the Westminster Primary Academy in Blackpool from the Times, where he said that in his school there was 20 children who had literally vanished over the course of 3 months, and the number of families referred to social services had risen by 22, so that's up by 40%. And he said that they'd put out feelers around Blackpool to try and look for them, but he thought maybe unemployment because of the tourist trade plummeting could have been a cause. But that's the picture there.
Great, Kim, that's really useful. Thank you so much. Let me get sort of close to the ground then. Can I come to you, Dan, just briefly? So I think Harris has got best part of 50 primary and secondary schools now, hasn't it? So across that should give you a pretty good idea of what's happening, certainly in and around London. So what have you been seeing, first lockdown, second lockdown, across the piece?
Thanks. In the first lockdown, we saw lots of children or the Caribbean or well, not lots, but a reasonable number, actually moved to the home country of parents. And in many cases, they were saying it was simply because they felt safe going back to places. We couldn't always establish if they really on. We did everything we could working with local authorities, but that was the thing we did in the first lockdown. We also saw that there were a large number of fees moving away when their support networks weren't possible to be with other family or friends in other places. We didn't experience a big growth in elective home education. What we see was a persistent and stubborn minority who refused to engage, who stayed home, on roll, but didn't want to engage in any rote learning. And in that situation, we've worked very closely with the education welfare services and all schools where we've had safer schools police officers to ensure that those children are safe by conducting weekly visits and all sorts of strategies to try and get them engaged with learning. But certainly elective home education for us in London in this period, something we've seen happen. Kids stay on roll and disengage, and we've seen them move away. We've seen a bit of county lines activity. We see that, and it hasn't been any greater than other years.
Okay, and Dan, all the things, all the sort of all those measures that are in place to locate a child if the school can't get hold of him or her, those things, in spite of the difficulties that, I'll come to you, Richard, on this in a second, in spite of all the difficulties that councils must be encountering through COVID, those things are still functioning, are they?
They're still functioning. Some of the support services in some of the councils we've worked with, speech and language, those kinds of services were obviously not available to youngsters because they were at home, and that hasn't helped. And some of the mental health support that would be available from local authorities, some of that wasn't funded for very good reasons because people weren't provided in the first lockdown, and that led to further absence who had anxiety and depression and other things. But generally, that's got better through the year. And our standard procedure if someone wants to elect to home education is we do everything we can working with the local authority to encourage the commitment that requires and the level of resources it requires to properly. And then they really, in the end, we give them a 15-day cooling off period so they can experience it a bit and come back. So well, that didn't work well. But in the end, it's the right of parents to do. And quite frankly, vanish off when they do it. It's a very strange system as far as we're concerned. And it's something we feel government should look at again.
Yeah, and look, we're definitely going to come on to talk about homeschooling because I think it is fascinating. So let me zoom out. So thanks, Andy. You've given us a picture, sort of, but at school by school sort of level. Let me zoom out to a sort of local authority and come to Richard Watts from Islington. Richard, if I can ask you the same question I put to Dan, just broadly, what's your experience been as a local authority through lockdown of children on school roles or moving off school roles?
Let me start actually by saying I agree with everything that Anne Longfield said about the picture before this. So this is not a new problem, but our experience is the pandemic has made it significantly worse. So just to give you stats for us as one relatively small local authority in the middle of London, for the year 2019, before the pandemic, between August and December, 54 children or families chose to electively home educate their children. For the same month in 2020, it was 162. So there's a very, very significant increase in the number of families choosing to electively home educate. And that time period corresponded effectively with the return to compulsory schooling. And what we think is there's a couple of different things going on. Clearly, there is a small number of families who, for philosophical, religious, or whatever reasons, are exercising their right to choose to home educate. However, the vast majority of the increase is because of nervousness about COVID. Now, I should be clear in saying there are a small number of families for whom that is a well-evidenced reasoned decision because of extreme clinical vulnerability to COVID means effectively that people need to be shielding through that period. However, they are in a small minority, and we work very closely with those families, and we absolutely try to ensure that there's kind of adequate learning support. What we are seeing though is families who have got a whole range of anxieties about sending their kids to school during the middle of a deadly pandemic. I think that is leading them to choose to electively home educate. My personal view is I think often those decisions are not made in the best interests of children. And there's a number of families who, if we're honest, we think are probably using COVID as a presenting issue, but actually what sits under that is a deeper kind of nervousness about their attachment to the school system, worries about their child's place in school, or perhaps even something more untoward than that. And I think there is a real concern, given the very, very lax regulation we have around elected home education in this country, and I'm happy to make some kind of moderate proposals to improve that during the course of the evening, that children can then effectively drop off the radar and become invisible. There's no compulsion at all for children who are home educated to register with any public body at all, which means that kids can just disappear. And other speakers have talked about, to a degree, that means some families who have no economic reason to be in this country disappearing back to Eastern European or wherever, and to a degree that's families will make that economic decision in their self-interest. What I'm talking about is where, in small numbers of cases, where there is effectively cover for abuse, because those stats that were shown also has shown a significant increase in domestic violence, in referrals to social services, and to some pretty terrible things happening in households during this pandemic as well. And I am very worried about what will be happening in some of those households where children have moved on to elective home education in this period.
Yeah, and like I say, Richard, we will definitely come back to talk in a bit more detail about home schooling. But once parents have elected to teach their child at home, then am I correct in thinking you don't have, as a counsellor, you don't have any further duties? You don't go around and check after 6 months or 2 years, or that's it, they're done?
Yeah, that's it. There's no duty for anyone to register. There's no power to inspect the quality of education they're getting. It is a very, very light touch system at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Richard. Marva, let me come to you. So we've done sort of school level, we've done local authority level. I think you've got your ears to the ground quite widely. You used to be a head teacher, now you're a consultant. So what picture have you seen emerge about school roles and school attendance through this pandemic?
The schools that I work with, I was head of a large primary, and 98% of our children were from a range of minority groups. So the primary schools I work with, mainly in Harringay, the Tottenham area, their issue are those families who are just leaving. And that was I was head in Edmonton, and children just left, parents just went home. And during the COVID lockdown, my schools have seen children just going home. It's not so much the local children who are long established who are leaving, and I haven't had more than 1 or 2 cases of parents choosing to educate at home. The main issue is trying to track them once they leave the country. And as primary heads, and it must be the same for secondary, we had this real expectation that we will know where all our children have moved to, and therefore the EWO could step in and help. But now the EWO is not there. The teachers are phoning in the very vulnerable children, and I noticed that if you name I note the note in the chat about saying children are vulnerable can make them vulnerable. But the schools have a range of mechanisms. Some children are phoned daily, some children are phoned twice a week, some children are phoned once a week. And what they do is to ensure that they hear the children's voices. So the numbers have decreased in the number of schools, but when you track them, they have all, we think, left the country. At secondary level, the challenge some schools are facing is just getting the young people out of bed and logging on. Because when you work in areas, when you operate in areas where so many parents on 0-hour contracts, the parents have to go to work if they're able to work. and the teenagers are left at home having to make decisions about logging on or not logging on or getting out of bed. And I think things are trickier at secondary level. At primary level, we seem to have a handle on the families because the children can't be left alone. But the numbers are decreasing in terms of people leaving the country. But I have to say, when I looked at the fact that long before this, so many children were out of education, and the reasons, there was a report published in 2018 called Children Missing Education. And the reasons given in that report are the same reasons we're using for COVID.
Okay, Martha, you're getting a lot of sort of love in the chat from Mark Rowland and my colleague Liz Mosley. So you take a look at that when you stop talking. But given what you said, it seems to me that chart that Kim showed us, which showed the sort of quite broad disparities in abscesses between different areas, that wouldn't surprise you given the different pressures that schools are under in different places.
In some of the needier the area and socioeconomically, the greater challenges, but also it's almost like the greater responsibility on the school as well, that we know a lot of our children won't eat if we don't get the vouchers sorted for them. We know a lot of the children with medical needs, the parents might not be able to cope with the medical needs, whereas if they were in school, a member of staff would be doing the exercises, etc. So there's a lot known about the parents, and these schools are used to responding in these level of deep in the areas of deep deprivation. So I'm not sure in an area where families are better off, the challenges must be different. But the schools in some areas have this long track record of checking in on families and the young children. And I think that may be where some of the difference lie. But the whole thing about this generation of children now, the more the virus persists, the more children we have who've lost a relative, the more children we have who've had a parent sick or they've been sick. So more children are having the real life experiences of COVID. So it's no longer a fear of being outside, it's also fear. The fear is so much nearer home for most of our children. And the teachers aren't there to help them. The teachers are somewhere on the phone. And also this whole pressure on families to say, well, your primary child has to have 3 hours of teaching a day and your secondary child 4 hours. That whole pressure on families is like a hothouse, isn't it? Things are going to get worse, I think, before they get better. But credit to the schools. I have read, I'm a governor of 3 schools. So I regularly read the risk assessments, and they are so detailed and so intensive that, and I have had teachers crying, by the way. I have had teachers crying because they're doing such an amazing job and they're exhausting themselves.
I bet, yeah. Okay. Martha, thanks for that. I'm going to come to my colleague Chris Cook in a second because he's been looking into this. And then if I can just, Susanna Kemp, if I can warn you that you've been making such interesting points in the chat that I want to come to you after Chris. But Chris, if you're there, I know that you did a little bit of digging around to see what was happening with school attendance and children coming off the rolls. What were the main sort of things that emerged when you were doing that?
I think one of the so I think we have to sort of separate out, if you like, the sort of long-term problem of school of off-rolling. So of children being bumped out of schools in some case, intentionally by the schools to flatter their own sort of league table position. And there's a sort of long-term effort and efforts to get those people dealt with. You have to sort of there's a second sort of tier issue of people who disappear into home education, often for quite bad reasons. So there's there are quite a large number of unregistered schools in London and in Birmingham as well. So schools that are largely run by, in London, it's largely Haredi Jewish schools in Northeast London. I bring those up because basically what happens is parents tell the schools they're home educating, they take them out of the school, they put them into these unregistered schools, which would never pass any inspection or health and safety requirement, and often teach very unusual and basically quite unpleasant curricula that don't leave kids prepared for the world. I bring that up because that is a mechanism which we might be seeing some of now as well. So effectively, people might be taking their kids out of school, saying they're homeschooling and putting them in sort of learning pods, which would be a kind way of describing an unregistered school. And actually, that's a thing that is happening a lot in the US. There hasn't been a lot of sort of coverage of whether this is a problem that's driving some of these numbers, but that might be part of what's going on. On attendance, one of the things that's really shocking is the regional element to this. So we're quite well represented here on our panel from our London schools, but London schools are quite, I mean, Dan has assets further afield, but largely London schools. The variation in attendance across the country is genuinely astonishing, and that the right.
Yeah, actually, I think it was Ian Duffy. I may not have been in, but I think Ian Duffy was making the point in the chat that maybe that was a function of when that snapshot was taken and the way that COVID has moved around the country at different times. So I suppose we'd need to take account of that, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and so earlier in the term, there was when the outbreak was really severe in the northwest, there was very clear.
Kim's answered that in the chat, by the way. Yeah.
But there are places that have not had serious outbreaks that have had individual boroughs that have not had huge outbreaks of massively outsized drops in attendance. And there are sometimes sort of they're not, I wouldn't say they're good reasons, but there are understandable reasons for why that happens. So, for example, it's been very striking that people from ethnic minorities who have the communities that have suffered the most from COVID have been most nervous about sending their kids back, especially if they live in multi-generational households. And part of what we've seen over the last few months is some of that. And there are individual boroughs where people have pulled their kids out or kept them at home, probably to protect other family members because they're worried about passing on. And it's very difficult to say they're making the wrong decision, right? Like it's for us to pompously decide that that's an unsafe decision. There are good reasons for some of this absence. I think all of the reason why we can't have exams this year that work is basically that, right? The decision to drop exams is really driven by the fact that if we hold exams this year, we're going to see enormous variation in the experience of children. If you like, on an honest basis. What we actually don't really know is what happens when things start getting more normal and how much normality will return to some of the people who can consistently happen.
Cheers, Chris. Thank you for that. I'll probably come back to you when we talk about homeschooling as well, because I don't want to neglect that. But I do want to bring in Suzanne Kemp, because she was making a ton of and still is making a ton of interesting points in the chat. If you're there, Susanna, yes, you are. So if I'm remembering correctly from what you said in the chat, you're involved in a multi-academy trust in the Northeast.
That's right.
You were making some points early on about parents' engagement with the school. So I guess one of the things that we've heard is that that there's a concern that maybe families who were perhaps slightly disengaged from education before COVID have disengaged further. But tell me, what's your experience been?
Yeah, that's completely our experience. So what's happened is we've always had to work incredibly hard at attendance. So we send minibuses to pick up children. We have all sorts of strategies just to get our attendance levels to sort of national average. And with COVID, it's just been so much harder. And absolutely, it is partly that thing Chris was saying in terms of some of our families who are from cultures and communities where there are many generations in the same household. That is absolutely about COVID anxiety. But then there is a huge proportion where there are families who have just never seen the worth of education. So where there is high unemployment, very deprived communities, where we've always struggled because we're saying to the children it's worth getting an education, and their parent or carer is saying, no, it isn't, it's pointless. So now there's an extra reasonable why bother, because we have an excuse because the government is saying schools are closed. Okay, that's so spectacularly unhelpful because all of our schools are open online. Okay, and for our vulnerable children, and we have double the free school meal measures, double the pupil premium, pretty much every measure of disadvantage, we're right up there. So there is now, whether it's subconscious or conscious, there's reasons why those families don't have to. And we have welfare teams in all of our schools, and we actually go and we knock on the doors if people won't pick up the phone to us. And you know, sometimes those welfare people just receive a lot of abuse. So it's tough, and the heads and all of the teaching staff are being incredible. But my last thought of it, and this makes it even harder for the teachers, is that because of the change in the definition of vulnerable children, there are now more children coming into the schools. So we're now expecting teachers to do both the remote learning classes and also manage the school attendance and the children who are coming into the schools, whilst some of them are shielding or off sick, etc. So the government has really made it hard.
Yeah, and Susanna, when you think about trying to turn that around, so let's be optimistic and cast forward to September this year, when we hope that things might be, you know, approaching normal again. Trying to unwind the harm that COVID has done, how hard a task does that seem to you at the moment?
Actually, it seems more doable than I think some people might expect. So with some things like the remote learning and the so I should explain, the foundation that I'm CEO of, the Laidlaw Foundation, is a sponsor of the schools for which I'm the chair in the Northeast. So it's the Laidlaw Schools Trust. So we made a decision to invest in Chromebooks for every single child from year 5+. So we have both primaries and secondaries. So we wanted to make sure that every child had access. We gave them dongles as well. So as well as the device, they had the Wi-Fi and so on. And because we've now trained our children and our teachers in Google Classroom and being able to provide some of this digital learning, actually with things like alternative provision, we now think we're going to be able to do that much better, because we're going to be able to have differentiated learning paths for children who all need to have alternative provision, but they can be in one space using digital learning to catch up in their own ways. So so the exam thing is a massive issue, because that's just made it even harder to engage people, because now children are really saying, well, seriously, what is the point of this being there? Because we're not even going to have exams. But we think that we've done some analysis. We've grouped our children into, okay, these are fine. These are the ones who can catch up with additional support. And this is where we've got a major issue. The major issue at the moment, we're thinking it's about 20% of the pupils.
Okay, that's a lot. Okay, let me, Susanna, thank you so much. Let me just come back to Marva with some of the points that you've raised, because Marva, how much do you think this kind of signalling around schools, that they're closed, that the on again, off again nature, how much of a problem do you think those signals have been to the families and the children who are receiving them?
I think it's confusing, but I think the real issue behind the you're in, you're out, you're in, you're out, is that it generates more and more fear. I mean, forget the fact that they were in on the 4th and out on the 5th, but you're in the school and suddenly a class goes out or a year group go out, the teacher goes out, the supply teacher comes in, the whole confusion around that for children. And we haven't really taken enough notice of how they're feeling, actually. Parents get more and more anxious. I don't know of any school locally where at any one point there isn't a class out until the lockdown. Of course, it's lockdown now. Where coming up to Christmas, every school I was in touch with, they had a year group out, a class out, teachers out, and the children are so getting so distressed because they're scared for their teachers. and they're scared for themselves. So the confusion is that the schools were neither closed or open. The headlines in public is schools are open. The reality for many of us sitting here is at any one point, sometimes half the school were actually not in school.
Yeah.
So it's just, and also we don't know what to do we? Because there's a virus there, and no, the government don't know what to do. We're not sure what to do. And we're just trying so hard to keep the teachers safe. Head teachers have died, teachers have died. So it's a whole mess. It's a big mess in the sense that the distress and it's almost like a horror story, isn't it? And yet teachers keep going. And yet teachers, even though they're scared, and teachers are scared, are going into schools to support the children. Yeah. Because even if you only have the very vulnerable in at the moment, that is still a group of children with a teacher. So I think we're just going to have to ride the storm, and the government needs to start making long-term plans, look beyond COVID. What is it we're going to do beyond COVID to get our schools back together? And rather than just focusing on the short-term reactionary approach is what we're having at the moment.
Okay.
But yeah.
Brilliant, Marva. Thank you so much. I just want, before I keep promising to turn quickly to home education, not quite doing it, but before I do that, I want to see if I can just bring Sian Woodhead in, because she'd be making some points in the chat about the role that mental health and child mental health services might have in this. Sian, if you're there, can I just ask you to sort of elaborate on what you were saying in the chat about what your experience or your, what your experience has been?
Yeah, so I'm a social worker in a disability team in the Northwest, and the experience for a lot of my children and young people, I think has been compounded by the change of our CAM service to a different approach. So they're not, unless they're at tier 4, which is really high risk, they're not actually going to have a care coordinator anymore, and they're going to be managed under a duty system. And I'm sure that you can all imagine that a lot of our young people who have autism and other additional needs, they need consistency of the person that's going to be involved. But one of the main barriers that I found earlier on in the first lockdown particularly was we adopted very quickly Teams and WhatsApp and virtual visits if families were at high risk or shielding or self-isolating. But actually the mental health service, it took about 2 or 3 months for them to get their virtual visit technology in place, which left a huge gap for young people who maybe can't communicate very well on the telephone, but actually a video call might have been better. Yeah, it's been a massive gap, and it's really affected young people. I work with quite a few who have real anxieties about school anyway, and that's just been made worse by COVID because they take things really literally. So when they see all the death tolls on television every day, that makes them think, I don't want to leave the house. I don't want to go anywhere. So it's had a massive impact. And I think I've now got more children who aren't attending school, not because their parents don't want them to, but because actually the children themselves have now got serious anxieties about leaving the house and about attending school.
Okay, Sian, thanks for that. That feels really important. So I'm really glad you've been able to raise it with us. Richard, can I come back to you, and then I want to come to Anne Longfield, Richard Watts. So you obviously are concerned about the monitoring and the oversight of home education. Just set out what your major concerns are.
I mean, look, many people who choose to home educate do a really, really good job, but I'm concerned it is a black hole in our safeguarding system, that there's no ability to try to find the small number of families for whom home education is a cover for something more sinister. And I think this crisis where, the one point I do want to make, if it's all right, just to very briefly, is not to underestimate the concerns of families for whom they're told school is safe, but it's simultaneously a vector of transmission, which is not a logical position I'm quite able to get my head around, I have to say. But that they're living with, in an area like Islington, in a highly overcrowded flat with a very vulnerable grandparent, And, you know, we have a lot of families in that position. There is a logic about why, if their child gets infected in school with COVID and or on the way to school, on the way, you know, hanging around with their mates on the way out again, that, you know, will almost certainly be absolutely fine for the child, but might have very, very significant ramifications for other household members as well. And I think there's a genuine fear about that in many of our kind of urban areas. But on home education, I think there are 4 changes that could be made that won't impinge on the rights of people who are doing this for the right reasons, but may be able to keep children safe. I think one of those is the removal of the option to electively home educate for the small number of children on child protection plans. I think I would introduce a compulsory registration so that local authorities at least know who all the children who are electively home educating in their area are. I think there should be some sort of requirement to allow the local authority to at least look every so often at what children are getting by way of home education. And I think there should be a requirement for parents who choose to electively home educate to cooperate with local authorities' inquiries to ensure that children are getting a suitable education. I think if we could do those things, which don't interfere in any way with parents who are doing a good job, as many are, I think it would take a significant loophole out of our children's safeguarding system.
Yeah, but and Richard, just to go back to the first of those, which I think amazes me and may amaze other people on the call. So you can be a child with a protection plan in place at the moment, and your parents can take you out of formal education and that's out of the sight of a local authority.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anne Longfield, are you still with us? Children's Commissioner.
Yes, I'm here.
Anne, this doesn't sound right to me. The lack of oversight, particularly for a child with that kind of protection plan in place. It seems amazing that we don't insist on better contact.
And I mean, I support completely all of those that Richard just said. One of the things when I was looking at this area a couple of years ago, all local authorities said they were worried about the safeguarding issues around this. And that's not to say that every child is at a safeguarding risk at all, but they were aware of that particular aspect. And local authorities now, some have put in place kind of support teams to help parents during this period, which I'm a real fan of because I can really see them making a difference. That's a team of maybe 2 or 3 people, but when a parent says they want to move their child onto homeschooling, they have kind of this month where they work with a team, and the team kind of works out, actually, is this what you want? Do you realize what it is? You aren't going to get these packs from school. You aren't going to do this. You're kind of on your own. And actually, do you just want to, is it something about the school environment that your child's currently in that you want to change? Would you like us to help negotiate you into a different school? And in a couple of the areas that I was talking to that were doing this, actually, the number of children that were being elected to have homeschooling dropped right down to virtually 0 during that time. So there's so much about that heightened point. This is in normal times and now, where the parents make that decision. And of course, once you've made that decision, it's very difficult to come back into that formal schooling because you've been out for ages. You then have to start to get back in, and you then have that kind of you're then told to be that you're the parent, you're the child who actually went out of school and was homeschooled. But there is a big thing as well about local authorities being able to visit and check without wanting to be to police it too much or interfere with the rights of parents too much. In Jersey, actually, you have to apply every year to homeschool, and they come in and check in terms of educational achievement. So there are different ways of doing this, but certainly at the moment, even when there are requirements for local authorities to check in on families, often because it's an area that just is very difficult to resource, you'll have one worker dealing with 500 families. And can you imagine how rigorous those checks can be? So children, it's an unknown. Some kids will have a fantastic time, but an awful lot would be better in a school. And there are real concerns about when it happens as well. You know, often it's when you're either into that second year of secondary school and you're losing that family connection, or indeed, again, you know, really worrying when schools are getting to that point where the kids going in for exams and, you know, they're worried about or they're concerned about what their marks might be.
Yeah, and I can, listening to Richard Watts in Islington, you can see that he's concerned that he's looking into a black hole and he can't see what's happening to the children who are being home educated. Do you know what the outcomes are for children in home education? Do you know if
not.
You don't know?
It's a complete unknown. No one knows whether how they've been educated, no one knows their outcomes, or indeed whether they're safe. Now, over a year ago, government did commit to establishing a register for children that have been registered at home. It's about a year and a half ago now, and it's yet to come to fruition. So that's something that really has quite an urgency around it, especially since the numbers are going up so much at the moment. But alongside that, there is really that point where keeping those kids in school where it's better for them to be in school, and also being able to set up that real relationship with the local authority to be able to provide better support and oversight into the family.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Dan Moynihan, can I come back to you, because you're making some interesting points, some slightly broader points in the chat about the educational effects of COVID, particularly the sort of disadvantage gap. So leaving aside our sort of main topic of school roles, absence from school roles and all that, what are your fears about what this is doing to particularly disadvantaged children with, you know, in relation to their more advantaged peers?
Thanks. I mean, we have a pretty unfair and unequal society, and you know, the job of good schools and great education is to make life fairer. And I put on the feed there that the Education Policy Institute said before COVID that the gap between disadvantaged and other students was equivalent to 18 months at age 16. I think it was 9.3 months at age 11. The gap even I think at 4 months with children starting at age 3 or 4. And through enormous effort, many schools were closing that gap, but at the current rate of progress, the estimate was it would take 500 years to that gap. Now, that's completely unacceptable on any level. Now, COVID's blown a hole in even that meager progress. But, you know, I understand what Suzanne's saying about buying Chromebooks, but, you know, online learning is a poor substitute for face-to-face teaching. And even though teachers are working really, really hard, you know, it cannot match the level of interaction, the relationship building, the support and encouragement, and the fact that when you come to school, you leave behind a certain amount of the inequality that exists. Everyone is on a level footing to some extent in school, and you can use that platform to build. We lose that. People in their home environment, the where they live isn't warm. I spoke to a parent this week about her problem was she couldn't even pay her electricity bill. So if we think that this online learning is any kind of substitute, I think it isn't. And we're going to see massive gaps opening up as a result, including in mental health. And there will be political ramifications longer term as people realize how hard done by they are, that will lead to societal change, which may not be pleasant. And you know, we need a national strategy to address this. There's a variety of alternative futures open to us. As a country, need to hit this head on and tackle disadvantage and resource into deliberately trying to close that gap. Because if we just go on as we are, it's not going to be good.
Dan, across your schools, obviously the ones that you know best, were you? Because I think the broad pattern was that the disadvantage gap had been closing for some years and then had started to widen again more recently. Were you seeing that in your schools as well?
We did the reversal. We were still closing, but I don't expect that to be the case when exams resume. I expect that gap, in spite of our best efforts, probably to open up again, because we'll have lost so much time, and we'll have lost all of the activities that we engage in, whether it's Saturday school or after school clubs, whether it's feeding kids during the school holidays while they learn. Unless there's a concerted resource behind it, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, okay. Marva, let me just come back to you, because I think, we're coming towards the end of our time here, but I just want to get a sense of what someone like you thinks that we should do now. We're not, we've still got months of this ahead of us. If you wanted to try to make sure that parents and children don't disengage from education even further, that those who were previously, struggling to engage don't use this opportunity to sort of absent themselves from the system, given what Dan was saying about the gap between face-to-face proper contact with kids and what you can do online, what would we be doing now, do you think, if we were trying to just make sure we stabilize things and don't make things worse over the next 3 or 6 months?
I don't know. I'm sorry. The thing is, for me, I'm being black. I've lived for the 60 years with the gap between black children and other children, particularly white children in schools. I was just putting a message. We've gone back from saying to parents, do the best you can to sit your child down for 3 hours a day or whatever. I don't see what they can do. I think what we have to do is to get the policymakers engaged with classroom teachers and have a long-term strategy. When we come out of this, children are going to be hugely disadvantaged. The gap's going to widen. So what? Now what? What can we do about it? Are we saying it's a hopeless case and there's nothing we can do about it? That's not good enough. We have to create a 3 or 4 year plan for doing something about the gaps that the virus has caused. It's a virus, it's nobody's fault. We can't just look at tomorrow and tomorrow. We've got to have a greater plan. I've already planning ahead. What's it going to look like next year in our schools? That's the plan we need to be looking at, because there's so little more, there's not a lot more teachers or parents can physically do in the present climate. We're in survival mode. So what's it gonna look like in 3 years? Come on, the FE, let's make a long-term plan.
All right, Marva, thank you so much. We're out of time. What it falls to me at the end of a conversation like this to try to do is just to figure out what we as Tortoise might take out of this, what we might try to investigate further, what we've learned really in the course of the last hour. And the answer, of course, is a tremendous amount. I think there's a common theme here, isn't there? A lot of things that we talk about in this pandemic are around the way that it has revealed problems that were there before and are now going to be dramatically worsened by the events of the last year or so. So that applies to the disadvantage gap that Dan Moynihan was talking about. We've heard from Susanna in the Northeast. We've heard from Anne and Marva and others about the way that effectively some parents, some families who were perhaps at the margins of education or were a challenge to engage with education have been not cast out of the system, but have disengaged from the system because of I think the signalling around schools has been a problem, and I think the opportunity that's presented to parents and children to absent themselves is a problem as well. I always worry when there's something that seems tremendously important, like proper oversight of where children are, how vulnerable they are, that there seems to be just an incredible absence of data around some of these things. So as Anne was saying, we just don't know a lot of facts and evidence about where children might be. I think our attitude towards homeschooling, the constraints we place on that is marks us out as an outlier within Europe. Certainly, we are really unusual in the lax regulations that we put around children's home education. I'm astonished to hear what Richard was saying, that you can be on a protection plan and still you can be that vulnerable a child, and still you can be taken out of formal education with minimal oversight. So I think we heard also that problem from Sian about the impact of mental health and the stresses and strains on mental health services, and how that will play out in children's absences or engagement in education. So there is a whole bunch of things that I think we will want to get into as Tortoise. I'm really grateful to Marva, to Dan, to Richard, to Anne Longfield, and everybody else who's chipped in this evening. You've given us a great start in this. I think we're going to want to come back to it. But for now, from me and from all of us at Tortoise, thank you so much for your help this evening.